The moon cast long, skeletal shadows across the grounds of Rosewood Plantation as Sarah Thornfield stood at her bedroom window, watching the slave quarters with narrowed eyes. A woman of 35 with porcelain skin and auburn hair pulled severely back from her face. She had inherited this sprawling Georgia estate 3 years prior, following her husband's unexpected death. The plantation sprawled across 500 acres of rich soil, its fields thick with cotton that would soon be ready for harvest in the late summer of 1851. "Madam!" a soft voice called from the doorway. Sarah turned to see Esther, a house slave of around 40, standing with her eyes downcast. "What is it?" Sarah asked, her voice clipped. "Mr. Jenkins has arrived. He awaits you in the study." Sarah nodded, smoothing the black fabric of her dress. Though her period of mourning had long passed, she maintained the wardrobe of a widow. "Tell him I'll be down shortly." When Esther had gone, Sarah opened the drawer of her vanity and removed a small crystal vial. The amber liquid inside caught the lamplight as she uncorked it and placed 3 drops under her tongue. The bitter taste of laudanum spread across her palate, bringing with it the familiar warm calm that would carry her through the evening's business. Downstairs, William Jenkins rose from his seat when Sarah entered. A lean man with a vulturine face and receding hairline, he managed several plantations in the county and had been invaluable in helping Sarah maintain Rosewood after Theodore's death. "Mrs. Thornfield," he said, bowing slightly, "you're looking well this evening." "Mr. Jenkins," Sarah replied, settling into the leather chair behind the mahogany desk. "What news do you bring?" Jenkins cleared his throat. "I'm afraid we have a situation. 2 of your field hands disappeared last night." Sarah's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the armrests of her chair. "Which ones?" "Isaiah and his son, Daniel." Jenkins consulted his notes. "Isaiah was purchased by your husband 7 years ago. The boy is 16 now." "I remember them." Sarah's voice was cold. Isaiah had been a problem before, questioned orders, worked slowly, looked at her with defiance in his eyes. His son was cut from the same cloth. "And you believe they've run?" "There's no doubt, ma'am. They took food from the kitchen, and a blanket is missing. I've already contacted the slave catchers. Marshal Brooks and his men will be here by morning." Sarah nodded. "Good. Make it known among the others what happens to runaways. I want them to watch when Brooks brings them back." Outside the window, thunder rolled across the darkening sky, and the first heavy raindrops began to fall. The summer storm that had been threatening all day had finally broken. "There's something else, ma'am," Jenkins said, hesitation evident in his voice. "There are rumors." "What kind of rumors?" Sarah's tone was sharp. "About a network, people helping slaves escape north. They say there's a route through the county, leading toward the Tennessee border." Sarah laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "The so-called Underground Railroad? Surely you don't believe such nonsense, Mr. Jenkins." "I wouldn't have mentioned it except—" He paused. 3 other plantations have lost slaves in the past month. All disappeared without a trace. Brooks hasn't found a single one. The laudanum had fully taken effect now, wrapping Sarah in a cocoon of detached calm. "Then Brooks isn't doing his job properly. No slave can travel hundreds of miles through hostile territory without being caught, unless they have help." She rose from her chair. "Double the night patrols. Anyone caught outside the quarters after dark is to be severely punished." "Yes, ma'am." "And Jenkins? Increase the reward for Isaiah and Daniel, $500 for their return." Her eyes glittered in the lamplight. Dead or alive. Later that night, as rain lashed against the windows and lightning fractured the sky, Sarah moved silently through the sprawling manor house. Most of the household slaves were asleep in their quarters, attached to the main building, but a few remained on duty throughout the night. She avoided them easily, making her way to the small room at the back of the house that had once been Theodore's private study. The key turned silently in the lock. Inside, Sarah lit a single candle and closed the heavy drapes before approaching the desk. From her pocket, she removed another key, this one smaller and made of brass. The bottom drawer of the desk opened with a soft click, revealing leather-bound ledgers stacked neatly inside. These were not the plantation's official accounts. Those were kept in the main office and reviewed regularly by Jenkins. These were Theodore's private records, documenting transactions of a different nature. Sarah ran her finger down the final page of entries, stopping at a name, Elijah Turner. Tomorrow she would send word to Turner. If Isaiah and Daniel had indeed found help escaping, Turner would know. The man had connections throughout the county, respectable on the surface, but Sarah's husband had known the truth. Turner was an opportunist who would sell information to anyone willing to pay. And Sarah was very willing to pay. She closed the ledger and locked it away again. As she stood, a floorboard creaked somewhere in the hallway outside. Sarah froze, listening intently, but the sound was not repeated. Still, she waited several minutes before extinguishing the candle and slipping back out into the corridor. The vast house seemed to shift and sigh around her as she made her way back to her bedroom. Rain continued to drum against the roof, and occasional flashes of lightning illuminated the portraits of Thornfield ancestors that lined the walls. Sarah had never felt comfortable among these stern-faced men and women. They had been Theodore's family, not hers. She had come to this house as a bride 20 years ago, the daughter of a Charleston merchant who had risen above his station through shrewd business dealings and an advantageous marriage of his own. In her bedroom, Sarah opened the crystal vial again, this time taking a larger dose. The laudanum was becoming less effective lately. She needed more to achieve the same sense of detachment. Lying in her four-poster bed, listening to the storm rage outside, Sarah tried not to think about what Theodore would say if he could see her now. He had warned her about the dangers of the medicine, had tried to wean her off it in the months before his death. But Theodore was gone, his body buried in the family plot behind the house, and Sarah was left to manage Rosewood alone. The plantation represented everything she had worked for, everything she had endured in her marriage. She would not let it fail. As sleep finally claimed her, Sarah's thoughts turned to Isaiah and Daniel. She had seen the looks that passed between them, father and son, had seen the way they watched the road whenever travelers passed by. Perhaps she should have separated them, sold the boy to another plantation, but Theodore had refused, saying it was cruel to break up families. Theodore had been weak in many ways. Sarah would not make the same mistakes. Morning brought with it clear skies and the arrival of Marshall Brooks. A mountain of a man with a weathered face and cold eyes, Brooks had made his fortune hunting runaway slaves. He arrived with 4 men and a pack of bloodhounds, the dogs straining at their leashes, eager for the hunt. Sarah received them on the front porch, dressed immaculately in a dark blue dress, her hair arranged perfectly beneath a small lace cap. She had taken only a small dose of laudanum with her breakfast, enough to steady her nerves, but not enough to dull her wits. "Mrs. Thornfield," Brooks said, touching the brim of his hat, "Jenkins filled me in on the details. We'll find your property. Don't you worry." "I expect nothing less, Mr. Brooks," Sarah replied. "I've increased the reward to $500. The smile spread across Brooks' face, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "That's mighty generous. We'll bring them back quick enough with that kind of money waiting." "I want the other slaves to see what happens to runaways," Sarah said. "Bring them to the main yard when you return." Brooks nodded, understanding perfectly what she was asking. "Yes, ma'am. We'll make an example of them." Sarah watched as the men gathered items belonging to Isaiah and Daniel for the dogs to scent. The bloodhounds bayed eagerly, pulling at their leashes as they caught the smell. Within minutes, Brooks and his men were mounted and following the dogs into the woods that bordered the eastern edge of the plantation. Jenkins approached as the hunting party disappeared among the trees. "I've increased the night patrols as you requested, ma'am, and I've sent word to Mr. Turner." "Good," Sarah said, turning back toward the house. "Have Esther bring tea to the sunroom. I'll be working on the household accounts this morning." "Yes, ma'am, and the field hands are waiting for your instructions regarding the East Cotton Field. Tell Jefferson to begin the harvest there tomorrow." I want 20 workers assigned to it. Jenkins made a note in his book. Very good, ma'am. As he walked away, Sarah noticed a small group of house slaves watching from the kitchen doorway. Their faces were carefully blank, but she could sense their tension. News of the escape and the hunting party would have spread quickly among them. "What are you staring at?" she called sharply. "Get back to work, all of you." They scattered immediately, disappearing into the house, all except one, a young woman named Harriet, who had been Sarah's personal maid since coming to Rosewood at the age of 12. She now stood alone in the doorway, her dark eyes meeting Sarah's for the briefest moment before she, too, turned away. That look troubled Sarah as she made her way to the sunroom. There had been something in Harriet's eyes. Not fear, not the usual careful deference, but something else. Something that looked uncomfortably like pity. The day passed slowly. Sarah tried to focus on the household accounts, but found her mind wandering. By mid-afternoon, she had increased her laudanum dose twice, seeking the familiar comfort of chemical calm. Outside, the plantation continued its daily rhythms. Field hands working under the hot Georgia sun, house slaves moving quietly through their tasks, the overseer's whip cracking occasionally in the distance. It was after sunset when a rider appeared on the road leading to the house. Sarah, who had been watching from her bedroom window, hurried downstairs to meet him. But it was not Brooks returning with the runaways. Instead, Elijah Turner dismounted in the front yard, handing the reins of his horse to a waiting stable boy. Turner was a slight man with thinning hair and spectacles, his appearance more suited to a clerk or schoolteacher than whatever shadowy profession he actually practiced. He bowed slightly to Sarah as she emerged onto the porch. "Mrs. Thornfield, your message said it was urgent." "Come inside, Mr. Turner," Sarah replied, leading him into the study where she had met with Jenkins the previous night. When the door was closed, she turned to face him. "I've lost 2 slaves. I have reason to believe they had help escaping." Turner's expression didn't change. "And you think I might know something about this?" "I think you know something about everything that happens in this county," Sarah said. "My husband certainly thought so." A ghost of a smile touched Turner's lips. "Mr. Thornfield and I had an understanding. I provided information. He provided compensation. And now you and I will have the same understanding." Sarah moved to the cabinet in the corner and poured 2 glasses of brandy, offering one to Turner. "I need to know if there's truth to these rumors about an underground railroad operating in the area." Turner sipped his brandy, regarding her thoughtfully over the rim of his glass. "Rumors are just rumors, Mrs. Thornfield. $500 says differently." His eyebrows rose. "That's a substantial sum. It's what I'm offering Brooks to bring back my property. I'll pay the same for information that helps me prevent further losses." Turner set his glass down carefully. "There are people who sympathize with the abolitionist cause, even here in Georgia. Some are more active in their sympathies than others." "Names, Mr. Turner. I want names." "That kind of information would be worth more than $500, Mrs. Thornfield. That kind of information could get a man killed." Sarah smiled coldly. 1,000 then. Half now, half when the information proves valuable." Turner considered this, then nodded. "I may have heard something about a Quaker family that moved into the county last year. The Wilsons. They keep to themselves, but there have been suspicions." "Suspicions aren't enough, Mr. Turner." "No," he agreed. "But the fact that they've been seen talking to a freedman named Solomon Porter might be of interest. Porter travels frequently between here and Savannah, supposedly selling handcrafted furniture, but his wagon has a false bottom." Sarah leaned forward. "Where can I find this Porter?" "He stays at the Wilson farm when he's in the area. They're about 10 miles north of here, near the crossroads at Miller's Creek." "And do you believe Isaiah and Daniel might have been helped by these people?" Turner shrugged. "It's possible. The timing would be right. Porter was seen in the area 2 days ago." Sarah walked to the desk and removed a small bag of coins from a drawer. She counted out $500 and pushed it across to Turner. You'll get the rest when this information bears fruit." After Turner had gone, Sarah sent for Jenkins. Night had fully fallen by the time he arrived, and she had taken another dose of laudanum. Her movements were slightly unsteady as she paced the study. "I want you to take 3 men to a farm near Miller's Creek," she told him. "A Quaker family named Wilson. There may be a freedman there called Solomon Porter. If he's there, bring him back here for questioning." Jenkins frowned. "Mrs. Thornfield, interfering with a freedman is perfectly legal, if we have reason to believe he's involved in helping slaves escape," Sarah interrupted. "Do you question my orders, Mr. Jenkins?" "No, ma'am," he said quickly. "We'll leave at first light." "You'll leave now," Sarah said. "Tonight." After Jenkins had departed, Sarah made her way to her bedroom, the effects of the laudanum making the familiar hallway seem longer and somehow distorted. Inside her room, she found Harriet laying out her nightclothes. "I didn't call for you," Sarah said, her words slightly slurred. "No, ma'am," Harriet replied, her eyes downcast. "I thought you might need assistance preparing for bed." Sarah watched as the young woman moved efficiently around the room, turning down the covers, arranging the pillows. There was something different about Harriet tonight, a tension in her movements, a careful precision that seemed forced. "You know something," Sarah said suddenly, "about Isaiah and Daniel." Harriet froze for the briefest moment before continuing her task. "No, ma'am. I know nothing about them." Sarah crossed the room in 3 unsteady steps and grabbed Harriet's arm, forcing the younger woman to face her. "Don't lie to me. I saw the way you looked at me this morning." "I don't know what you mean, ma'am," Harriet said, her voice steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. "I think you do." Sarah's grip tightened. "I think you know exactly where they've gone. And you're going to tell me. Mrs. Thornfield, you're hurting me." Sarah released her abruptly. The laudanum was making it difficult to think clearly, but somewhere beneath the drug-induced fog, she knew Harriet was hiding something. "Get out," she said coldly. "Send Esther to me instead." When Harriet had gone, Sarah sank onto the edge of her bed, her head spinning. She shouldn't have taken that last dose of laudanum. Theodore had always warned her about taking too much, had worried about her increasing reliance on the drug. But Theodore wasn't here anymore, and the laudanum was the only thing that helped her sleep, the only thing that kept the dreams at bay, dreams of Theodore's face on that final night, the accusations he had hurled at her, the knowledge in his eyes before he collapsed, clutching his chest. Sarah shook her head, trying to clear it. She couldn't afford to be clouded by the drug. Not tonight. Not when she was so close to discovering the truth about the escaped slaves. Esther appeared in the doorway, her aged face impassive. "You called for me, ma'am?" "Yes," Sarah said, straightening her spine with effort. "Help me prepare for bed. And Esther, have someone watch Harriet. I don't want her leaving the house tonight." "Yes, ma'am." As Esther helped her undress, Sarah's thoughts returned to Isaiah and Daniel. If Brooks didn't find them by tomorrow, they would have a substantial lead. If they reached the Wilsons, or this Porter person Turner had mentioned, they might make it to the Tennessee border. And from there to Kentucky, Ohio, and freedom. She couldn't allow that to happen, not just because of the financial loss, but because of what it would mean. Others would follow. The carefully maintained order of Rosewood would crumble. Sarah slipped beneath the covers as Esther extinguished the lamps, leaving only a single candle burning on the bedside table. Outside, an owl called mournfully from the woods, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked, perhaps one of Brooks' bloodhounds still hunting in the darkness. "Esther," Sarah said as the older woman turned to leave, "do you think they'll find them? Isaiah and Daniel?" Esther paused, her face half in shadow. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, ma'am." It wasn't an answer, but Sarah was too tired to press further. As the door closed behind Esther, she reached for the crystal vial on her bedside table. Just one more small dose, she told herself, just enough to help her sleep. As the laudanum took hold, Sarah's last conscious thought was of the look in Harriet's eyes that morning. Not fear, not deference, but pity. As if Sarah was the one to be pitied, not the slaves who had fled into the night. Dawn broke over Rosewood plantation in a wash of pale gold light, revealing dew-soaked fields and the distant silhouettes of slaves already at work. Sarah Thornfield awoke with a pounding headache and a mouth that felt stuffed with cotton, after effects of the laudanum she had taken the night before. She lay still for several moments, allowing her senses to gradually sharpen before ringing the small silver bell beside her bed. No one came. Frowning, Sarah rang again, the sound shrill in the quiet room. Still, the door remained closed. This was unusual. Harriet or Esther typically responded within moments, eager to avoid any accusation of laziness. "Harriet!" Sarah called, her voice hoarse. When there was no response, she rose unsteadily and pulled on her dressing gown. Esther! The house beyond her bedroom was unnaturally quiet. No sounds of breakfast being prepared in the kitchen below, no soft footsteps of house slaves going about their morning duties. Sarah felt a prickle of unease as she made her way down the corridor toward the back stairs that led to the servants' quarters. The small room that Harriet shared with two other house slaves was empty, the beds neatly made. Sarah continued to the kitchen, where the hearth was cold, no breakfast preparations in evidence. The back door stood slightly ajar, and when Sarah pushed it open, she saw footprints in the dewy grass leading toward the slave quarters beyond the main house. A noise from the front of the house caught her attention, the sound of horses approaching. Sarah hurried through the dining room and entrance hall, reaching the front door just as Marshal Brooks dismounted in the yard. His clothes were mud-splattered, his face grim beneath several days' growth of beard. "Mrs. Thornfield," he said, touching his hat briefly, "did you find them?" Sarah demanded. Forgetting her state of undress in her eagerness for news, Brooks shook his head. Trail led to the river and disappeared. They must have waded upstream to throw off the dogs. He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the ground. "We followed both banks for miles, but nothing." Sarah's fingers tightened on the doorframe. "You're giving up?" "No, ma'am," Brooks said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "We'll keep looking, but I wanted to report back, let you know the situation." "Where are your men?" "Still searching the North Woods. I came back alone." Sarah nodded tersely. "Keep looking. The reward stands." As Brooks remounted his horse, Sarah became aware of another rider approaching from the direction of Miller's Creek. It was Jenkins, riding hard, his horse lathered with sweat. He reined in sharply beside Brooks, acknowledging the slave catcher with a brief nod before turning to Sarah. "Mrs. Thornfield," he said, his voice tight with tension, "we found the Wilson farm." "And?" Sarah prompted when he hesitated. "Empty, they're gone, the whole family, left sometime yesterday by the look of things. Neighbors said they loaded a wagon after dark and headed north." Sarah's headache intensified, a sharp pain behind her eyes. "What about Porter, the freedman?" "No sign of him, but—" Jenkins exchanged a glance with Brooks. "We found something else. In the barn." "What?" "Hidden compartments in the floor. Big enough to hide people." Jenkins wiped sweat from his brow despite the early hour. "And this?" He reached into his pocket and withdrew a scrap of cloth. "One of my men found it caught on a nail in one of the compartments." Sarah took the fabric, recognition dawning immediately. It was a piece torn from the distinctive checked shirt that Daniel had been wearing the day before he disappeared. "They were there," she said, more to herself than to Jenkins, "at the Wilson farm." "Yes, ma'am, but they're long gone now." Sarah turned abruptly and walked back into the house, leaving the two men exchanging confused glances in the yard. Inside, she leaned against the wall of the entrance hall, the scrap of fabric clutched in her hand, trying to think through the pounding in her head. Isaiah and Daniel had escaped with the help of the Wilsons and likely this Porter person. They had hidden at the farm until Porter could transport them further north, and now they were gone, beyond her reach. But there was something else nagging at her, the empty house, the missing house slaves. Sarah pushed herself away from the wall and walked quickly to the window that overlooked the slave quarters and fields beyond. In the distance, she could see field hands at work, the familiar rhythm of plantation life continuing. But closer, Around the cluster of cabins that housed the domestic slaves, there was unusual activity. People gathered in small groups, talking. Sarah rang the bell in the entrance hall, the one used to summon slaves from the quarters when needed. She rang it 3 times, the signal that the mistress required immediate attention. Then she waited, watching through the window. No one came. After 10 minutes, Sarah's unease had grown to anger. She returned to her bedroom, dressed quickly without assistance, and made her way back downstairs. Jenkins was waiting in the study, his hat in his hands. "The house slaves are refusing to work," Sarah said without preamble, "and I suspect more have run off." Jenkins nodded grimly. "Not just the house slaves, ma'am. Jefferson reports that 12 field hands didn't report for the morning roll call." Sarah sank into the chair behind the desk. 12. The number was staggering, nearly a fifth of Rosewood's workforce, representing thousands of dollars in lost property. "Yes, ma'am, all from the East Field quarters. Jefferson thinks they left sometime during the night." Sarah's mind raced. 12 field hands, plus Harriet, Esther, and however many other house slaves had disappeared. This wasn't a simple escape. This was coordinated, organized. "Brooks said the trail led to the river," she said slowly. "They must have had boats waiting." Jenkins nodded. "That would explain how they moved so many people without being detected. And the Wilsons were part of it. This underground railroad that everyone dismisses as rumor." Sarah's voice hardened. "I want the sheriff here, now, and send riders to all the neighboring plantations. They need to check their slave populations immediately." As Jenkins hurried to carry out her orders, Sarah opened the desk drawer and removed her vial of laudanum. Her hands trembled slightly as she measured out 3 drops, more than her usual morning dose. But she needed clarity now, needed the calm detachment that only the drug could provide. The bitter taste flooded her mouth, and she waited for the familiar warmth to spread through her veins. But something was wrong. The effect was weaker than usual, the relief less immediate. Sarah frowned at the vial. Had the drug lost its potency? Or had her body simply grown too accustomed to it? She took another 3 drops, then put the vial away. There would be time later to worry about the laudanum. For now, she had a crisis to manage. The sheriff arrived an hour later, a portly man named Thomas Whitley, who owed his position more to his family connections than any particular aptitude for law enforcement. He listened to Sarah's account with a skeptical expression that made her want to slap him. 12 field hands and how many house slaves?" he asked, making notes in a small book. "At least 5 that I've confirmed missing," Sarah replied. "Possibly more." Whitley whistled through his teeth. "That's quite an operation, Mrs. Thornfield, to move that many people without being detected. Which is why I'm reporting it to you, Sheriff. This isn't just about my property. This represents a threat to every plantation in the county." "Now, Mrs. Thornfield," Whitley said, his tone maddeningly patronizing, "let's not get ahead of ourselves. Slaves run off all the time. Maybe yours just got the same idea at once." Sarah fixed him with a cold stare. 17 slaves got the same idea at once? And managed to disappear without a trace, despite Brooks and his men searching the woods with bloodhounds. Despite the night patrols I had instituted. She leaned forward. "This was organized, Sheriff. The Wilsons were involved. Jenkins found evidence at their farm, and they fled north." Whitley shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "The Wilsons are Quakers, ma'am. Religious folk. Not the type to break the law." "Quakers are abolitionists," Sarah said sharply, "and they've been helping my slaves escape. I want them found and charged." "I'll look into it," Whitley said in a tone that suggested he would do no such thing. "But they're out of my jurisdiction now if they've crossed into Tennessee." Sarah's headache was returning, the laudanum's effects already fading. "And what about my property? Who will compensate me for this loss?" Whitley closed his notebook and stood. "You can file a claim with the county clerk, but I wouldn't hold out much hope, ma'am. The county fund for compensating slave owners is nearly depleted after the Morgan plantation fire last month." After the sheriff had gone, Sarah remained at her desk, staring out the window at the plantation grounds. The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. 17 slaves gone, representing a financial loss that Rosewood could ill afford. The harvest season approaching, with fewer hands to bring in the cotton crop, and the knowledge that the careful order she had maintained since Theodore's death had been shattered in a single night. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was one of the remaining house slaves, a young girl named Lucy. "What is it?" Sarah asked tersely. Lucy kept her eyes downcast. "Jefferson says the field hands are restless, ma'am. They've heard about the ones who escaped. He thinks there might be trouble." Sarah rose from her chair. "Tell Jefferson I want all the slaves gathered in the main yard, now." The sun was high overhead by the time the plantation's remaining slaves, field hands, house servants, stable boys, and kitchen workers were assembled in the yard. Sarah stood on the front porch, looking down at the sea of dark faces turned toward her. Jenkins stood at her side, his expression grim. "Last night," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly in the still summer air, 17 of your fellow slaves chose to steal themselves from this plantation. They broke the law, violated their oaths, and betrayed my trust." A murmur ran through the crowd, quickly silenced by the overseer's threatening gestures. "Make no mistake," Sarah continued, "they will be found. Marshal Brooks and his men are tracking them as we speak. And when they are returned to Rosewood, their punishment will serve as an example to anyone who might consider following in their footsteps." She paused, scanning the crowd. Most avoided her gaze, but a few stared back defiantly. Sarah made note of these faces. "In light of this betrayal, new rules will be implemented immediately. No slave is to leave their quarters after sundown without written permission. Anyone found outside after dark will be whipped. The number of field hands assigned to each task will be doubled to compensate for those who have fled. This means longer hours and harder work for all of you." Another murmur, louder this time, with an undercurrent of anger. Sarah raised her voice to be heard over it. "And finally, anyone with information about last night's escape will be rewarded. Tell Jefferson, Jenkins, or myself what you know, and you will be granted privileges, better quarters, extra rations, lighter duties." She let these words sink in. "Choose wisely where your loyalties lie." As the slaves were dismissed back to their tasks, Jenkins turned to Sarah. "Do you think any of them will come forward?" "Perhaps," Sarah said. "Fear and hunger are powerful motivators, and there are always those willing to betray their fellows for personal gain." The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Sarah took increasing doses of laudanum to combat her headache and the growing sense of anxiety that threatened to overwhelm her. By evening, she had questioned 3 house slaves who had remained behind, but learned nothing useful. Either they genuinely knew nothing about the escape, or they were too afraid or too loyal to their fellow slaves to speak. As darkness fell over Rosewood, Sarah found herself once again in Theodore's private study, the ledgers open before her. The plantation's finances, already precarious after 2 seasons of lower-than-expected yields, now faced the additional burden of the lost slaves. Sarah would need to purchase replacements before the harvest reached its peak, but where would the money come from? She turned the pages of the ledger, reviewing Theodore's careful notations. There were assets she could liquidate, some land to the west that wasn't currently under cultivation, perhaps some of the silver and jewelry she had brought to the marriage. But it wouldn't be enough to replace all 17 slaves. A knock at the study door interrupted her calculations. It was Jenkins, his face taut with tension. "What is it?" Sarah asked, noting the unusual hour for his visit. "Marshal Brooks has returned, ma'am. He's asking to see you immediately." Sarah's pulse quickened. "Has he found them?" "No, ma'am, but he's discovered something disturbing." Brooks was waiting in the entrance hall, his clothes even more mud-splattered than before, his face haggard with exhaustion. When he saw Sarah, he removed his hat, revealing hair matted with sweat. "Mrs. Thornfield," he said, his voice hoarse. We followed the trail to the North Woods, beyond Miller's Creek, lost it several times, but the dogs always picked it up again. And? Sarah prompted impatiently. We found a camp, ma'am, recently abandoned, fire still warm. Brooks hesitated. There were at least 20 people there based on the tracks, and not just your missing slaves. Sarah frowned. What do you mean? Tracks indicated wagons and horses, white people, ma'am, helping them. Jenkins stepped forward. The Wilsons. Possibly, Brooks said. But there were others too. Based on the tracks, I'd say at least 3 wagons, maybe more, and they're heading north, toward the Tennessee border. Sarah's mind raced. 3 wagons, carrying her escaped slaves and perhaps others from neighboring plantations. An organized operation, just as she had suspected. The Underground Railroad was real, and it was operating right under their noses. How far ahead are they? She asked. Half a day, maybe less, Brooks replied. We'd have caught up to them, but... He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. But what, Mr. Brooks? We were ambushed, ma'am. About 5 miles north of Miller's Creek. Men with rifles, hidden in the trees, shot 2 of my dogs before we could take cover. Brooks's face darkened with anger. White men, helping slaves escape. It's not natural. Sarah felt cold despite the warm evening air. Were any of your men injured? No, ma'am, but we had to fall back. By the time we circled around, the wagons were gone. Brooks twisted his hat in his hands. Mrs. Thornfield, I've been hunting runaway slaves for 15 years. Never seen anything like this. It's organized, professional. Sarah turned to Jenkins. Send riders to the neighboring plantations. I want to know if they've had similar losses. To Brooks, she said, rest your men and dogs tonight. Tomorrow, I want you to pick up the trail again. With respect, ma'am, Brooks said, I don't think that's wise. These abolitionists are armed and clearly willing to kill. My men signed on to track runaways, not to engage in gunfights with fanatics. Sarah felt a surge of anger. You're refusing to continue the hunt? After I've offered $500 per slave? Brooks met her gaze steadily. I'm saying the price just went up, ma'am. 1,000 per head, and combat pay for my men. That's extortion, Sarah hissed. That's business, Brooks replied calmly. You want your property back, that's what it'll cost. Otherwise, my men and I will be moving on to the next job. Sarah wanted to refuse, to order him off her property, but she knew she had no choice. If the slaves reached the Tennessee border, they would be beyond her reach, lost forever. Fine, she said coldly, 1,000 per slave. But I expect results, Mr. Brooks. After the men had gone, Sarah returned to the study and poured herself a glass of brandy. The laudanum wasn't working properly anymore. She needed something stronger to calm her nerves. As she sipped the fiery liquid, she tried to make sense of the day's revelations. The Underground Railroad was operating in Georgia, right in her own county. The Wilsons were part of it, along with others who, neighbors perhaps, people she had sat next to in church, dined with at county gatherings, people who smiled to her face while plotting to destroy everything she had built. And Isaiah. Sarah's thoughts returned to the field hand who had started all this. He must have been planning his escape for months, making connections, waiting for the right moment. Had he known about the network of abolitionists? Had he somehow made contact with them from within Rosewood's boundaries? The idea was chilling. It meant there were other channels of communication, other ways for the slaves to reach the outside world that she knew nothing about. Sarah's glass was empty. She refilled it, then opened the desk drawer and took out the crystal vial of laudanum. Combining the drug with alcohol was dangerous. Theodore had warned her about that too, in the early days of her dependence. But Theodore wasn't here, and Sarah needed the oblivion that only the combination could provide. As the brandy and laudanum took effect, Sarah's thoughts grew hazy. Images floated through her mind. Isaiah's defiant eyes, Harriet's pitying glance, Theodore's face on the night he died. The ledgers open on the desk before her seemed to blur and shift, the numbers dancing across the page. Sarah didn't remember climbing the stairs to her bedroom. didn't remember removing her dress or lying down on the vast four-poster bed. But she must have done these things, because the next thing she knew, she was awakening to bright sunlight streaming through the windows and the sound of voices raised in alarm somewhere outside. Her head pounded as she rose unsteadily and moved to the window. In the yard below, a group of men on horseback had gathered. Jenkins was among them, gesticulating urgently as he spoke to the others. Sarah recognized several neighboring plantation owners: Montgomery from Oak Hill, Davis from Willow Creek, Peterson from Magnolia Grove. She dressed hurriedly, not bothering with the elaborate hairstyle she usually maintained. Her hands trembled as she fastened the buttons of her dress, and she took a small dose of laudanum to steady them. Then, squaring her shoulders, she made her way downstairs to meet the assembled men. "Mrs. Thornfield," Montgomery said as she emerged onto the porch. A corpulent man with a florid face, he owned the largest plantation in the county. "Jenkins has told us about your situation. I'm afraid we bring similar news." Sarah's stomach tightened. "You've lost slaves as well." 14 from Oak Hill, Montgomery confirmed grimly, "and Davis lost 9 from Willow Creek. 11 from Magnolia Grove," Peterson added. "All disappeared 2 nights ago." Sarah did the calculation quickly. 17 from Rosewood, 14 from Oak Hill, 9 from Willow Creek, 11 from Magnolia Grove. 51 slaves vanished without a trace. "This is unprecedented," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's an insurrection," Montgomery declared, his jowls quivering with indignation. "A conspiracy against the natural order." Davis, a lean man with the perpetually sunburned face of someone who, unlike most plantation owners, actually spent time in his own fields, nodded in agreement. "We've heard reports from the next county over. Similar disappearances there, all within the past week. We need to act," Peterson said. "Form a militia, patrol the roads, stop and search all wagons heading north." Montgomery turned to Sarah. "Jenkins says you have information about who might be helping them." Sarah hesitated. The laudanum had not yet taken full effect, and her thoughts were still clouded from the previous night's excess. "I have suspicions," she said carefully. "A Quaker family named Wilson, living near Miller's Creek, and a freedman called Solomon Porter." "The Wilsons," Davis spat. "I never trusted them, always preaching about the evils of slavery while profiting from our cotton at their mill." "They're gone," Sarah said. "Fled north with the escaped slaves." Montgomery leaned forward in his saddle. "There must be others. A network this extensive couldn't operate without local support." "Turner," Sarah said suddenly, the name coming to her through the fog in her mind. "Elijah Turner. He knew about the Wilsons, about Porter. He sold me the information." The men exchanged glances. "Turner is a snake," Peterson said. "Sells information to anyone willing to pay, but he might know more than he told you." "We should pay him a visit," Montgomery suggested, a dangerous gleam in his eye. "Convince him to share everything he knows." As the men rode off in search of Turner, Sarah turned to Jenkins. "Any word from Brooks?" "Not yet, ma'am. They set out at first light." Sarah nodded, feeling the laudanum finally beginning to take effect, smoothing the jagged edges of her anxiety. "Have Lucy prepare breakfast, and find someone to replace Harriet. I need help dressing properly." But even as she gave these orders, Sarah knew that the normal routines of plantation life had been irrevocably disrupted. 51 slaves missing from 4 plantations, with reports of more disappearances in neighboring counties. This was more than a few isolated incidents of escape. This was organized resistance, and somewhere to the north, Isaiah and Daniel were moving closer to freedom with every passing hour. The midday heat lay heavy over Rosewood Plantation as Sarah Thornfield sat at her desk, reviewing the latest tally of losses. The other plantation owners had returned from their confrontation with Elijah Turner, bringing with them disturbing news. Turner had been found in his small office in town, dead by his own hand, a pistol still clutched in his right hand, a pool of congealed blood beneath his chair. On his desk, a half-written letter addressed to Sarah, containing only the words, Mrs. Thornfield, I regret to inform you that my previous information was incomplete. The network is more extensive than I initially believed. The rest of the page was blank, whatever revelations Turner had intended to share dying with him. Whether he had killed himself out of fear of what the plantation owners might do to him, or out of remorse for betraying the abolitionist network, or for some other reason entirely, would remain a mystery. Sarah set aside the letter. The sheriff had allowed her to keep it after his cursory investigation, and turned her attention to the more pressing matter of the plantation's operations. With 17 slaves missing, the carefully balanced system of labor that kept Rosewood functioning had been thrown into disarray. Field hands had been reassigned, house slaves given additional duties, and even the children who usually helped only with the lightest tasks had been pressed into more demanding work. A soft knock at the study door interrupted her thoughts. It was Lucy, the young house slave who had taken over many of Harriet's duties. "Mr. Jenkins to see you, ma'am," Lucy said, her eyes carefully downcast. Sarah nodded. "Send him in." Jenkins entered, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. His face was drawn with fatigue. Like Sarah, he had barely slept in the 2 days since the escape. "Any word from Brooks?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer from Jenkins' expression. "No, ma'am, nothing since yesterday morning." Sarah's fingers tightened around the pen she had been using to make notations in the ledger. "He's had more than enough time to pick up the trail again." "The weather hasn't helped," Jenkins offered. "That thunderstorm last night would have washed away any tracks." Sarah didn't respond to this excuse. Both of them knew that Brooks and his men had likely abandoned the pursuit, despite the increased reward she had offered. The risk of confrontation with armed abolitionists had proven too great, even for men accustomed to the violent business of slave catching. "There's something else, ma'am," Jenkins said, after a moment of uncomfortable silence. "Reverend Clark is here to see you." Sarah frowned. Thomas Clark was the Presbyterian minister whose church she attended each Sunday, more out of social obligation than religious conviction. "What does he want?" "He didn't say, just that he needed to speak with you on a matter of some urgency." Sarah sighed. The laudanum she had taken earlier was beginning to wear off, and the familiar tension was building behind her eyes. The last thing she needed was a sermon from Clark about Christian forbearance in the face of trials. "Very well, show him in." Reverend Clark was a tall, thin man with prematurely white hair and the perpetually worried expression of someone who sees sin everywhere he looks. He bowed slightly as he entered the study, his black coat immaculate despite the heat. "Mrs. Thornfield, thank you for seeing me on such short notice." Sarah didn't rise from her chair. "Reverend, this is an unexpected visit." Clark cleared his throat. "I've heard about the unfortunate events of recent days, the loss of your servants and those from neighboring plantations." "News travels fast," Sarah said dryly. "Have you come to offer spiritual comfort, Reverend?" A flicker of something, discomfort, concern, passed across Clark's face. "In a sense, yes, but also to bring something to your attention that I believe may be relevant." Now Sarah was curious despite herself. "Go on." Clark seated himself in the chair opposite her desk, folding his hands in his lap. "As you know, I travel throughout the county in my ministerial duties. Last week I was visiting the Wilsons, the Quaker family near Miller's Creek." Sarah leaned forward. "The Wilsons are implicated in the escape of my slaves, Reverend. They've fled north." "Yes, I've heard," Clark said, nodding, "which makes what I observed during my visit all the more significant in retrospect." "And what did you observe?" Clark hesitated. "Nothing concrete. Nothing I could point to as definitive evidence of wrongdoing. But there was unusual activity around their barn. Wagons coming and going at odd hours, strangers who didn't attend their Quaker meetings." He paused. "And I overheard a conversation between James Wilson and another man, someone I didn't recognize. They were discussing packages that needed to be moved quickly." "Packages," Sarah repeated, the word bitter on her tongue. "A convenient euphemism for human property." Clark's expression remained neutral. I cannot say with certainty what they were referring to, but in light of recent events. He spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. Sarah studied the minister's face. Why are you telling me this, Reverend? Why not go to the sheriff? Sheriff Whitley has been informed, Clark assured her, but I felt a moral obligation to speak with you directly, as a member of my congregation and as someone directly affected by these events. There was something in Clark's manner that Sarah couldn't quite identify, a guardedness perhaps, or a calculation behind his pious exterior. You said you didn't recognize the man speaking with Wilson. Can you describe him? Tall, well-dressed, not a local by his accent, northern, I believe. He called himself Smith, though I doubt that was his real name. And when exactly did this visit take place? Last Thursday, 6 days ago. Sarah's mind raced. 6 days ago, just before the mass escape. Time enough for the Wilsons and this Smith to finalize their plans, to coordinate with sympathizers on other plantations, to arrange transportation north. Thank you for this information, Reverend, she said, her tone making it clear that the interview was concluded. Clark rose, but didn't immediately move toward the door. There is one other matter, Mrs. Thornfield, of a more personal nature. Sarah frowned. Oh. Several members of the congregation have expressed concern about your health. They've noticed changes in your behavior during Sunday services. Drowsiness, difficulty focusing. Clark's eyes flicked briefly to the crystal vial visible on the corner of her desk. As your spiritual advisor, I feel obligated to inquire if all is well. A surge of anger rose in Sarah, hot and immediate. My health is not the concern of the congregation, nor of yourself, Reverend, and I suggest you focus your moral scrutiny on the criminals who have stolen my property rather than on my personal habits. Clark bowed slightly, unperturbed by her anger. Of course, Mrs. Thornfield, I meant no offense. I'll pray for the swift return of your servants and for your continued well-being. After Clark had gone, Sarah remained at her desk, seething with resentment. The hypocrisy of the man, coming here under the pretense of sharing information, when his real purpose was clearly to pry into her use of laudanum, and the veiled judgment in his eyes, as if her reliance on the drug was somehow comparable to the crime of stealing slaves. The crystal vial glinted in the afternoon sunlight filtering through the study window. Sarah reached for it, telling herself that she needed the clarity of thought that only the laudanum could provide. As she measured out the drops onto her tongue, more than usual, but these were unusual circumstances, she thought about Clark's description of the strange northern man at the Wilson farm. Could he be an abolitionist agent sent south to coordinate the Underground Railroad's activities? The timing of his visit, just days before the mass escape, was too perfect to be coincidental. And if he was still in the area, possibly organizing more escapes? Sarah pulled a sheet of paper toward her and began to write a letter to Sheriff Whitley, detailing Clark's observations and demanding a more vigorous investigation. By the time she finished, the laudanum had taken full effect, lending her a sense of detached confidence that had been lacking in recent days. She rang for Lucy to deliver the letter to the sheriff immediately, then turned her attention back to the ledgers. The financial reality of Rosewood's situation was becoming clearer with each passing day. Without the missing slaves, and with no realistic prospect of their return, the plantation faced a significant labor shortage heading into the harvest season. Sarah would need to either purchase new slaves, a substantial investment that the plantation's finances could ill afford, or hire temporary workers, which would eat into the already thin profit margins. There was a third option, one that Sarah had been reluctant to consider, selling part of the plantation's land. Theodore had expanded Rosewood's holdings during their marriage, purchasing adjacent properties when they became available. Some of this land was less productive than the original estate and could potentially be sold without significantly impacting the cotton yield. The idea of selling any part of Rosewood was painful to Sarah. The plantation represented everything she had worked for, everything she had endured in her marriage to Theodore. It was her security, her position in society, her future. To diminish it in any way felt like admitting defeat. But as she reviewed the numbers again, Sarah was forced to acknowledge that she might have no choice. The loss of 17 slaves, valued conservatively at $500 each, represented an $8,500 reduction in Rosewood's assets, a devastating blow to the plantation's financial stability. A commotion outside drew Sarah's attention from these grim calculations. Voices raised in alarm, the sound of running feet. She rose and moved to the window overlooking the front yard. A rider was dismounting, one of Brooks' men, his clothes torn and blood-stained, his horse lathered with sweat. Sarah hurried from the study and out onto the front porch, where Jenkins was already questioning the exhausted rider. "What happened?" Sarah demanded, interrupting whatever the man had been saying to Jenkins. The rider turned to her, his face haggard with fatigue and something else, fear. "Mrs. Thornfield," he said, removing his hat. "I'm Jacob Mercer, one of Marshal Brooks' men." "Where is Brooks? Did you find the runaways?" Mercer glanced at Jenkins before answering. "Marshal Brooks is dead, ma'am. So are Simmons and Watts. The rest of us barely escaped with our lives." Sarah felt as though the ground had dropped away beneath her feet. "Dead? How?" "Ambush," Mercer said grimly. "About 15 miles north of here, near the Tennessee border. We picked up the trail yesterday morning, followed it to an abandoned farmhouse. Brooks thought the runaways might be hiding there, so we approached after dark." He paused, wiping sweat from his brow with a trembling hand. "They were waiting for us, at least 10 men with rifles hidden in the trees around the house. They opened fire as soon as we entered the clearing. Brooks was hit first, right through the heart. Simmons and Watts went down before we could take cover." "The slaves?" Sarah asked, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. "My property." "No sign of them, ma'am. Just the men with rifles. White men." Mercer's voice hardened on these last words. "Abolitionists," Jenkins murmured. "The same ones who ambushed you before." Mercer shook his head. "Can't say for sure. But they were organized, disciplined. Not just farmers with guns. They knew what they were doing." He hesitated. "One of them spoke after the shooting stopped. Said to tell you that any slave catchers who cross into Tennessee will meet the same fate." Sarah's fingers dug into the wooden railing of the porch. "They murdered 3 men in cold blood, and they dare to claim moral superiority." "What did you do after the ambush?" Jenkins asked Mercer. "Retreated back across the state line. I came straight here to report while the others headed home." Mercer replaced his hat, his hands still unsteady. "I'm sorry, ma'am. We did our best, but those slaves are gone. Anyone who goes after them is signing their own death warrant." After Mercer had been given food and a place to rest, Sarah returned to her study, Jenkins following close behind. The news of Brooks' death had shaken her more than she cared to admit. Not because she had any particular affection for the slave catcher, he had been a brutal, mercenary man, but because of what it represented. A direct, violent challenge to the system that underpinned her entire world. "This changes everything," Jenkins said, echoing her thoughts. "If abolitionists are willing to kill to protect escaped slaves, then they're no better than the criminals they claim to oppose." Sarah finished harshly. "They're murderers, Jenkins, and they'll be hunted down and punished accordingly. The law may see it differently in Tennessee," Jenkins pointed out. "It's not a slave state." Sarah waved this objection away. "Murder is murder, regardless of state lines, and 3 men are dead." She paced the length of the study, her mind racing. "We need to inform the other plantation owners and the sheriff. A posse should be formed immediately." "Mrs. Thornfield," Jenkins said carefully, "with respect, I'm not sure that's wise. These abolitionists are clearly well armed and prepared to use deadly force. A posse crossing into Tennessee would likely meet the same fate as Brooks and his men." "So we do nothing?" Sarah demanded, rounding on him. "Let them steal our property and murder our citizens without consequences?" Jenkins didn't flinch under her glare. I'm suggesting we approach this strategically. The escaped slaves are beyond our reach now. That's a financial loss we'll have to absorb. But our priority should be preventing further escapes. Increased security on all plantations, stricter control of slave movements, investigation into possible sympathizers still in the area. Sarah knew Jenkins was right, but the idea of abandoning pursuit of the escaped slaves, of Isaiah and Daniel, who had started all this, was infuriating. The rational part of her mind acknowledged that they were gone, almost certainly already in Tennessee and moving quickly north toward Kentucky, Ohio, and eventual freedom. But something deeper, more primal, rebelled against the idea of surrender. "Very well," she said finally. "Send word to Montgomery, Davis, and Peterson, and to any other plantation owners who have lost slaves. We'll meet here tomorrow to discuss a coordinated response." After Jenkins had gone to carry out these instructions, Sarah locked the study door and took another dose of laudanum. The drug no longer provided the blissful detachment she craved. Instead, it merely dulled the edges of her anxiety and anger, making them manageable but still present. She knew she was taking too much, knew that her dependency was deepening with each passing day, but without the laudanum, the crushing weight of Rosewood's precarious situation would be too much to bear. As evening fell over the plantation, Sarah made her way to the small family graveyard behind the main house. Theodore's grave was marked by a simple marble headstone, his name and dates carved in elegant script. Sarah hadn't visited the grave in months. There had seemed no point, with Theodore beyond hearing whatever she might say to him. But tonight, standing before the cold stone as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Sarah found herself speaking aloud to her dead husband. "You were right," she said softly, "about the laudanum, about the slaves, about all of it." In the months before his death, Theodore had argued repeatedly with Sarah about her management of the plantation. He had advocated for better conditions for the slaves, for keeping families together, for a less harsh discipline regime. Sarah had dismissed his concerns as weakness, as a failure to understand the economic realities of plantation management. And the laudanum. Theodore had been the first to notice her increasing reliance on the drug, her need for higher doses to achieve the same effect. He had tried to limit her access, had consulted with doctors about treatments for dependency. Sarah had resented his interference, had hidden vials of the drug throughout the house to ensure she would never be without it. On the night he died, the night of their final terrible argument, Theodore had found her cache of laudanum bottles. The confrontation that followed had been vicious, with accusations hurled by both sides. And then Theodore had clutched his chest, his face contorting in pain, and collapsed to the floor of their bedroom. By the time the doctor arrived, he was gone. A heart condition, the doctor had said. Nothing anyone could have done. But Sarah had always wondered if the stress of their argument had contributed to his death. If, in a sense, she had killed him with her stubbornness, her refusal to acknowledge her dependency, her harsh management of Rosewood that he had found so troubling. "I'm losing it all, Theodore," Sarah whispered to the silent grave. "Everything we built together, and I don't know how to stop it." The following morning dawned clear and hot, the Georgia summer showing no mercy, even in the early hours. Sarah awoke from a fitful sleep, plagued by dreams of pursuit. She had been running through endless cotton fields, desperate to escape something terrible behind her. The irony of this dream was not lost on her as she rose and prepared to meet with the other plantation owners. By 10 o'clock, the study was crowded with men, Montgomery, Davis, and Peterson, whom she had summoned, but also several others who had heard about the meeting and invited themselves. The air was thick with cigar smoke and tension as Jenkins recounted what they had learned from Mercer about Brooks's death. "This is an act of war," declared Montgomery when Jenkins had finished. His face was flushed with anger, sweat beading on his forehead despite the relative coolness of the morning. "These abolitionists have moved beyond rhetoric to violence. They must be met with the same." "And how do you propose we do that?" asked Davis, ever the practical one. form a militia and march into Tennessee? That would be suicide, based on what happened to Brooks. Not to mention potentially illegal, added Peterson. We have no authority beyond the state line. Montgomery waved these objections away. The law has failed us. Sheriff Whitley has done nothing but file reports. The federal government is too busy appeasing northern interests to protect our property rights. We must take matters into our own hands. And do what, exactly? Sarah asked, her voice cutting through the murmurs of agreement that had followed Montgomery's declaration. Chase shadows through the woods until we're all shot like Brooks and his men. Our priority should be protecting what remains of our property, not pursuing what is already lost. All eyes turned to her, some of the men clearly surprised by her pragmatic stance. They had expected her, as the most directly affected by recent events, to be the most aggressive in demanding retribution. Mrs. Thornfield is right, Jenkins said into the silence that followed her words. Our immediate concern should be preventing further escapes. The network that helped these slaves flee is clearly still operating in the area. The Wilsons have gone, said one of the other plantation owners, Beaumont, from a smaller property to the east, and Turner is dead. Who else could be involved? An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. The implication of Beaumont's question was clear. If not the obvious outsiders, the Quaker family, the mysterious information broker, then the conspiracy must involve members of their own community, people they knew, worshipped with, dined with. We need to consider everyone, Sarah said finally, even those we believe we can trust. Idim. The meeting continued for another hour, with various proposals put forward for increased security and surveillance. Additional night patrols, rewards for information about suspicious activities, a system of signals between plantations to alert others to potential escape attempts. All reasonable measures, but Sarah could see from the faces of the men around her that they were missing the central point. The world they had known, the system they had relied upon, was changing beneath their feet. As the meeting broke up, Montgomery lingered behind, waiting until the others had filed out before approaching Sarah. "A word in private, if I may," he said, his voice lowered. Sarah nodded, signaling to Jenkins to leave them alone. When the door closed behind him, Montgomery dropped his usual bombastic manner, his expression becoming serious. "You've been managing Rosewood alone since Theodore's death," he began. "A considerable achievement for a woman, especially given the plantation's size." Sarah raised an eyebrow at his condescending tone, but didn't interrupt. "However," Montgomery continued, "recent events have demonstrated the vulnerability of a plantation without a strong hand at the helm." He cleared his throat. "I've been considering expanding Oak Hill's operations. The acquisition of additional land would allow for economies of scale that would benefit both properties." Sarah stared at him, understanding dawning. "Are you offering to buy Rosewood?" "Not buy, precisely," Montgomery said, a slight flush spreading across his already florid face. "Rather, a merger of our interests. Through marriage." For a moment, Sarah was too stunned to respond. Montgomery was proposing marriage. Or rather, proposing a business arrangement that happened to include marriage. The man was at least 15 years her senior, twice widowed, with a reputation for harshness toward his slaves that exceeded even her own strict management. "I'm flattered by your offer," she said finally, her tone making it clear she was anything but. "However, I have no intention of remarrying, nor of relinquishing control of Rosewood to anyone." Montgomery's expression hardened. "Consider carefully, Mrs. Thornfield. You've lost 17 slaves. The harvest season approaches. Without additional capital, Rosewood will struggle to survive." "Rosewood has weathered challenges before," Sarah replied coldly. "I appreciate your concern, but my answer is final." After Montgomery had gone, his departing bow stiff with offended pride, Sarah poured herself a glass of brandy despite the early hour. The confrontation had left her shaken, not just by the unexpected proposal, but by the calculation behind it. Montgomery had assessed Rosewood's vulnerability and moved to exploit it, like a predator sensing weakness in its prey. And the worst part was, he wasn't wrong about the plantation's precarious position. The loss of the slaves had created a financial hole that would be difficult to fill. The harvest was approaching, with insufficient hands to bring in the cotton crop. And now, with Brooks' death, there was the added fear that more slaves might attempt to escape, seeing that the Underground Railroad had successfully transported so many to freedom. Sarah took another sip of brandy, then reached for the crystal vial of laudanum. As she measured out the drops onto her tongue, she realized that the vial was nearly empty. She would need to send for Dr. Phillips soon to obtain another prescription. The thought filled her with a mixture of shame and defiance. Shame at her dependency, defiance at the idea that she should deny herself the only thing that made Rosewood's burdens bearable. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Messages arrived from neighboring plantations reporting increased security measures. Jenkins organized the remaining field hands into new work groups to compensate for the missing slaves. Lucy and the other house slaves moved silently through their duties, their faces carefully blank, revealing nothing of their thoughts about recent events. As evening approached, Sarah found herself once again in Theodore's private study, reviewing the ledgers that detailed Rosewood's financial position. The numbers were unforgiving. Without additional capital, the plantation would indeed struggle to survive the coming year. Montgomery's assessment had been accurate. If his proposed solution was unacceptable, Sarah's options were limited. She could sell some of Rosewood's land, but in the current climate, with fears of slave revolts and abolitionist interference running high, she would be unlikely to get a fair price. She could attempt to secure a loan from the bank in Savannah, but again, the economic uncertainty might make such financing difficult to obtain. Or she could sell some of her personal assets, the jewelry she had inherited from her mother, the silver that had been a wedding gift from her father. The thought was painful. These items represented her heritage, her connection to a family long gone, but they might be enough to see Rosewood through the current crisis. A soft knock at the study door interrupted these calculations. It was Lucy, her young face solemn in the lamplight. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but there's someone here to see you." Sarah frowned. "At this hour? Who is it?" "A man named Porter, ma'am. Solomon Porter." Sarah's heart seemed to stop for a moment, then resume at double speed. Solomon Porter, the freedman who had been implicated in the escape, who had been seen at the Wilson farm with his wagon that contained hidden compartments. The man who had presumably transported her slaves toward freedom. And now he was here, at Rosewood, asking to see her. "Where is he?" Sarah asked, rising from her chair. "In the front hall, ma'am." "Has Jenkins been informed?" Lucy shook her head. "Mr. Jenkins rode to town an hour ago, ma'am. He hasn't returned." Sarah considered her options. She could have Porter detained until Jenkins returned, or the sheriff could be summoned. But something, curiosity perhaps, or a desire to confront one of those responsible for Rosewood's current predicament, made her decide differently. "Show him in," she said. "And then leave us?" Porter entered the study with the cautious air of a man walking into a lion's den. He was tall and lean, his skin the deep brown of strong coffee, his clothes simple but well-made and clean. Sarah guessed him to be in his 40s, though it was often difficult to determine the age of colored people. "Mrs. Thornfield," he said, removing his hat and inclining his head slightly. Not quite a bow, but an acknowledgement of her position. "Mr. Porter," Sarah replied, remaining seated behind the desk. "You have considerable courage coming here." A slight smile crossed Porter's face. "Or considerable foolishness, depending on one's perspective." "Indeed, especially given your role in recent events." Porter's expression didn't change. "I'm not sure what events you're referring to, ma'am." "Don't play games with me," Sarah snapped. "You were seen at the Wilson farm. Your wagon has hidden compartments. You've been transporting my property north to Tennessee." Porter studied her for a moment, his dark eyes revealing nothing of his thoughts. "You seem very certain of these accusations." "Not certain enough to have you arrested the moment Jenkins returns," Sarah said coldly. "Or I could simply call for the stable boys to detain you. Even a freedman can be charged with theft for assisting in the escape of slaves." "You could do that," Porter agreed. "But I think you'll want to hear what I have to say first." Something in his tone, a calm confidence that bordered on arrogance, made Sarah hesitate. "And what is that?" Porter took a step closer to the desk. "I have information about your husband's death." Sarah felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her. "What?" she whispered. "Theodore Thornfield didn't die of a heart condition, Mrs. Thornfield. He was poisoned." The study seemed to spin around Sarah, the walls contracting and expanding with her heartbeat. "That's a lie," she managed to say, her voice barely audible. "Is it?" Porter asked quietly. "You were administering laudanum to him in increasingly large doses, weren't you? For his insomnia." Sarah stared at him, unable to form words. It was true that Theodore had suffered from difficulty sleeping in the months before his death. She had obtained laudanum from Dr. Phillips to help him rest, the same laudanum she had later begun taking herself. "How could you possibly know that?" she finally asked. "Esther knew," Porter said simply. "She saw you adding it to his tea each night. At first, just small amounts, then more and more." Sarah felt a cold dread spreading through her body. "Esther, my house slave?" "My mother," Porter corrected. "Though you never knew that, did you? Slave families are so easily separated, their connections forgotten or ignored by their owners." The revelation struck Sarah like a physical blow. Esther, the quiet, efficient house slave who had served Rosewood for as long as Sarah had been mistress there, was Porter's mother, and she had seen. "I never poisoned Theodore," Sarah said, her voice stronger now, fueled by anger at the accusation. "The laudanum was prescribed by Dr. Phillips. It was medicine, not poison." "In small doses, yes," Porter agreed. "But in the quantities you were administering, night after night, it weakened his heart, Mrs. Thornfield, made him susceptible to the final attack." "Dr. Phillips said it was a natural condition," Sarah insisted, "a weakness of the heart that could have claimed him at any time." "Dr. Phillips is known for his discretion," Porter said, "especially when dealing with prominent white families. But he knows the truth, just as Esther did, just as you do." Sarah felt as though she might vomit. The room continued to spin around her, Porter's calm face the only fixed point in her vision. "Why are you telling me this?" she managed to ask. "Why now?" "Because you need to understand the cost of what you're doing," Porter said. "Not just to your slaves, but to yourself. The laudanum that killed Theodore is now killing you slowly but surely. I can see it in your face, your hands, your eyes." Sarah's fingers tightened around the edge of the desk. "You know nothing about me. I know more than you think, Mrs. Thornfield. I know that Theodore was planning to free some of his slaves before he died, Isaiah and Daniel among them. I know that you countermanded those plans after his death. I know that you've increased the workload and decreased the rations at Rosewood, driving people to desperation." "Get out," Sarah whispered, trembling with rage and fear. "Get out before I have you arrested." Porter didn't move. "You won't do that, because if I'm arrested, everything I know becomes public. About Theodore's death, about the laudanum, about all of it." "No one would believe you," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. "The word of a freedman against a plantation owner." "Perhaps not," Porter conceded. "But once the questions are raised, the suspicions planted, and there are others who know pieces of the truth. Esther, Dr. Phillips, even Jenkins has his suspicions, I think." Sarah felt trapped, cornered like an animal. "What do you want?" "I want you to let them go," Porter said simply. "Isaiah, Daniel, Harriet, Esther, all of them. Stop hunting them. Accept that they're gone." "They're my property," Sarah said automatically, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "They're people," Porter corrected, "with the same desire for freedom that you would have in their place." Sarah looked away, unable to meet his steady gaze. "And if I refuse? Then the next time I come to Rosewood, it will be with the sheriff. Not Whitley, who can be bought, but the federal marshal from Savannah, and I'll tell him everything I know about Theodore Thornfield's death." The threat hung in the air between them, terrible in its simplicity. Sarah knew Porter was right. Even if his accusations couldn't be proven, the mere suggestion that she had poisoned her husband would be enough to destroy her standing in the community. The questions, the whispers, the sidelong glances. She would become a pariah, Rosewood's reputation tarnished beyond repair. "How do I know you won't go to the authorities anyway?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "You don't," Porter admitted. "You'll have to trust my word, just as I'm trusting yours now by coming here alone." Sarah laughed bitterly. Trust. Between a plantation mistress and a man who steals slaves. Between two human beings, Porter corrected. "That's all any of us are in the end." He replaced his hat and turned toward the door, apparently confident that she wouldn't call for help, wouldn't have him detained. And he was right. The risk was too great. If what he said was true, if Esther had seen her administering the laudanum to Theodore— "Wait," Sarah said as Porter reached the door. "How did you know? About the laudanum I take now?" Porter turned back to her, his expression softening slightly. "Your hands shake in the morning, but are steady by afternoon. Your pupils contract unnaturally. Your moods shift rapidly. All signs that Esther recognized, having seen them in Theodore." He paused. "She worried about you, you know, despite everything." With that, he was gone, leaving Sarah alone in the study with the weight of his revelations pressing down upon her. Outside, night had fallen completely, the windows reflecting her own pale face back at her. Had she killed Theodore? Not intentionally, certainly. She had never meant to harm him, had only wanted to help him sleep, to calm his anxieties about the plantation, about her increasingly harsh management of the slaves, about her own growing dependency on the drug. But the laudanum had been administered in larger and larger doses as Theodore built up a tolerance. And she had been the one measuring those doses, adding them to his tea each night without his knowledge, telling herself it was for his own good. Sarah reached for the nearly empty vial on her desk, staring at the amber liquid inside. The same laudanum that might have contributed to Theodore's death was now her constant companion, her comfort, her curse. Porter was right about that much. It was killing her, slowly but surely. But without it, how would she face the truth of what she had done? How would she manage Rosewood with its mounting problems and uncertain future? How would she sleep at night knowing that she might have killed her husband through carelessness or willful ignorance of the drug's dangers? Outside the study window, a mockingbird sang in the darkness, its varied calls seeming to mock her predicament. Sarah uncorked the vial and raised it to her lips, drinking the last of the laudanum directly rather than measuring out drops. The bitter taste flooded her mouth, familiar and comforting, despite its associations with loss and dependency. Tomorrow she would send for Dr. Phillips. Tomorrow she would face the decisions that needed to be made about Rosewood's future. Tomorrow she would confront the possibility that she had contributed to Theodore's death. But tonight she would seek the oblivion that only the laudanum could provide. One last time. The following morning dawned with a sky the color of bruised flesh, heavy clouds threatening rain that would delay the cotton harvest yet again. Sarah Thornfield stood at her bedroom window, watching as the remaining field hands made their way to the east fields, their movements sluggish with fatigue and resentment. The increased workload she had imposed after the escape was taking its toll, pushing them to the limits of their endurance. Sarah herself felt hollowed out, her body aching from a night spent in fitful sleep, punctuated by vivid, terrifying dreams. The laudanum had worn off hours before dawn, leaving her trembling and nauseous, her mind racing with the implications of Porter's visit. Had she killed Theodore? The question haunted her, repeating itself in an endless loop as she dressed without assistance, her fingers fumbling with the buttons of her dress. No, she told herself. It had been a heart condition. Dr. Phillips had said so. But even as she formed this denial, Sarah knew there was truth in Porter's accusation. The laudanum she had administered to Theodore, increasing the dose over time without his knowledge, could indeed have weakened his heart, made him susceptible to the attack that claimed his life. And now the same drug held her in its grip, altering her judgment, clouding her thinking, making her dependent on its false calm to face each day. The nearly empty vial on her bedside table seemed to mock her, a physical manifestation of her weakness and complicity. A knock at the bedroom door interrupted these dark reflections. It was Lucy, her young face carefully blank, as she announced that Jenkins had returned from town and was waiting in the study with urgent news. Sarah nodded, dismissing the girl with a wave. Before leaving the bedroom, she glanced once more at the laudanum vial, but forced herself to turn away without taking a dose. Her head pounded and her hands trembled, but she needed clarity now, needed to face whatever crisis had brought Jenkins back to Rosewood so early in the morning. Jenkins was pacing the study when Sarah entered, his normally composed demeanor replaced by agitated movement. He stopped when he saw her, his expression grave. "Mrs. Thornfield," he said, bowing slightly, "thank you for coming so quickly." Sarah took her seat behind the desk, noticing the slight widening of Jenkins' eyes as he observed her appearance. She knew she looked unwell, pale, trembling, with dark circles beneath her eyes, but chose to ignore his unspoken concern. "What news from town?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Jenkins hesitated. "There have been developments. Sheriff Whitley received a telegram from the federal marshal in Savannah. They're investigating the death of Marshal Brooks and his men." Sarah frowned. "That's to be expected, surely. 3 men were murdered." "Yes, but—" Jenkins cleared his throat. "The investigation has expanded to include the circumstances surrounding the escape of slaves from multiple plantations. The federal authorities suspect a conspiracy." "Of course there was a conspiracy," Sarah said impatiently. "We already know about the Wilsons, about Porter, about this underground railroad network operating in the area. It's not that kind of conspiracy they're investigating, ma'am." Jenkins met her gaze directly. "They're looking into the possibility that some plantation owners in the county have been selling their slaves to northern abolitionists, then claiming they escaped to collect insurance payments." Sarah stared at him, momentarily speechless. "That's absurd," she finally managed to say. "Who would do such a thing? No one has been accused directly, but rumors are circulating." Jenkins looked uncomfortable. "Your name has been mentioned." "My name?" Sarah's voice rose in outrage. "I lost 17 slaves. Rosewood is struggling to function without them. Who would dare suggest I would deliberately undermine my own plantation? The timing is unfortunate," Jenkins said carefully. "Coming so soon after Mr. Thornfield's death, and with the plantation's finances already strained. Some are suggesting you might have seen it as a way to raise capital quickly." Sarah's hands clenched into fists on the desktop. "This is Montgomery's doing, isn't it? After I refused his proposal yesterday, he's trying to destroy me another way." Jenkins didn't confirm or deny this, which was answer enough. "The federal marshal will be arriving next week to conduct interviews. Sheriff Whitley wanted you to be prepared." Sarah forced herself to take a deep breath, to think through the implications of this development. The investigation itself was a problem, bringing unwanted scrutiny to Rosewood's operations. But it also presented an opportunity, a way to shift attention from her own potential complicity in Theodore's death to this false accusation about selling slaves. "We have nothing to hide," she said firmly. "The slaves escaped with the help of abolitionists. We have evidence of that. The Wilson farm, Porter's involvement, the violent resistance when Brooks attempted to pursue them across the state line, all of this supports our version of events. Jenkins nodded, though his expression remained troubled. There's something else, ma'am. Something I discovered while in town. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. This was being distributed at the general store. Sarah unfolded the paper, her eyes widening as she took in its contents. It was a crude drawing of a black woman standing beside a white man, with text beneath that read, Esther, formerly of Rosewood Plantation, now residing in Freedom in Ohio, with her son Solomon Porter. All who seek liberty may find the path through trusted friends. This is... Sarah couldn't find words to express her outrage, her shock at the blatant provocation of the broadside. It's a message, Jenkins said quietly, to the slaves who remain in the county, telling them that escape is possible, that there are people willing to help them. Sarah crumpled the paper in her fist. Have there been other escapes since ours? 3 from the Davis plantation last night, a family, husband, wife and child. The news settled like a stone in Sarah's stomach. It was happening again, the coordinated resistance that had cost Rosewood so dearly. And now this broadside, confirming what Porter had told her the night before. Esther was his mother, and both were now free in Ohio. Has Sheriff Whitley seen this? She asked, indicating the crumpled paper. Jenkins nodded. He's ordered his deputies to confiscate any copies they find and arrest anyone distributing them. But the damage is done. The message has spread. Sarah rose from her chair and moved to the window, looking out at Rosewood's fields where the diminished workforce labored under the threatening sky. How many more would attempt to escape now that they knew others had succeeded? How many were already making plans, establishing contacts with the Underground Railroad, preparing to flee north to freedom? Double the night patrols, she said without turning around. No slave is to leave their quarters after dark under any circumstances. Any violation is to be punished immediately and publicly. Yes, ma'am. Jenkins hesitated. And what about the federal investigation? Should we consult a lawyer? Sarah turned back to face him. Yes. Contact Harrison in Savannah. Tell him I need his advice regarding these false accusations. After Jenkins had gone to carry out these instructions, Sarah remained at the window, her thoughts in turmoil. The crumpled broadside lay on the desk behind her, a tangible reminder of the forces aligned against Rosewood, against the entire system upon which her world was built. Porter's visit the night before took on new significance in light of these developments. He had come not just to threaten her with exposure regarding Theodore's death, but to demonstrate his power, to show that he could enter Rosewood itself with impunity. And now this broadside, distributed openly in town, featuring Esther, her house slave of 20 years, and Porter himself. The audacity was breathtaking. And effective, Sarah had to admit. The message would spread like wildfire among the slave population, offering hope and concrete proof that escape was possible, that freedom could be attained. Sarah returned to her desk and smoothed out the crumpled paper, studying the crude drawing more carefully. Esther's face was recognizable despite the simple line work, her high cheekbones, her dignified bearing, captured with surprising accuracy. Porter stood beside her, tall and straight-backed. Both figures had an expression of serene confidence that Sarah found deeply unsettling. Was this how Esther had looked all along, beneath the carefully blank expression she had maintained in Sarah's presence? Had the older woman been secretly judging her, watching as she administered laudanum to Theodore, observing as she herself became dependent on the drug? The thought was unbearable. Sarah shoved the broadside into a drawer and rang for Lucy, instructing the girl to bring her morning tea. When Lucy returned with the tray, Sarah dismissed her curtly and locked the study door before removing the small vial of laudanum from her pocket. Her hand trembled as she measured 3 drops into the tea. It was less than her usual dose, a conscious attempt to begin reducing her dependency, even as she acknowledged her inability to function without the drug entirely. The bitter taste mingled with the sweet tea, familiar and comforting despite everything she now knew about the laudanum's effects. As the drug began to take effect, dulling the edges of her anxiety and steadying her hands, Sarah turned her attention to Rosewood's immediate problems. The federal investigation was a serious threat, one that required careful management. If the authorities began examining the plantation's finances too closely, they might discover irregularities that Sarah herself had only recently become aware of. Discrepancies in the ledgers that suggested Theodore had been moving money out of Rosewood's accounts in the months before his death. Sarah had assumed these withdrawals were related to gambling debts, or perhaps an investment Theodore hadn't discussed with her. But what if they represented something else? What if, as Porter had claimed, Theodore had been planning to free some of his slaves? Such an action would have required capital, to provide the freed slaves with some means of establishing themselves, to replace their labor on the plantation. The possibility sent a chill through Sarah, despite the laudanum's warming effect. If Theodore had indeed been planning such a radical step, it would have fundamentally altered Rosewood's operations, its value, its future. Everything Sarah had worked for, had endured her loveless marriage for, would have been jeopardized. A knock at the study door interrupted these disturbing reflections. It was Jenkins again, his expression even more troubled than before. "Mrs. Thornfield," he said when she had unlocked the door, "Jefferson needs to speak with you urgently. There's a situation in the East Fields." Sarah's heart sank. What kind of situation? The field hands are refusing to work. They've laid down their tools and are sitting in the field. "All of them?" Sarah asked, incredulous. Jenkins nodded grimly. "Every last one." The East cotton field stretched before Sarah like a white-flecked ocean, the bolls ready for harvesting nodding gently in the breeze beneath the threatening sky. In the middle of this expanse, the field hands of Rosewood Plantation sat in silence, their tools abandoned beside them, their faces turned toward the small group approaching from the main house. Sarah walked at the front of this group, her spine rigid with anger and apprehension. Behind her came Jenkins, Jefferson the overseer, and 4 white men armed with whips and pistols who served as slave patrollers on the plantation. The display of force was deliberate, a reminder to the slaves of the consequences of disobedience. As they drew closer to the seated workers, Sarah could see the mixture of fear and determination in their faces. Some looked down as she approached, the habit of deference too ingrained to break completely. But others met her gaze directly, a challenge that would have been unthinkable just days before. "Stand up," Sarah commanded when they reached the edge of the group. "All of you, on your feet now." For a moment no one moved. Then slowly an older man rose from his position near the front of the group. Sarah recognized him as Moses, one of Rosewood's longest-serving field hands, a man who had worked the plantation's soil for over 30 years. "We ain't working today, Mrs. Thornfield," Moses said, his voice steady despite the risk he was taking. "Not until conditions improve." Sarah stared at him, momentarily speechless at the audacity of this declaration. Behind her, she heard Jefferson curse under his breath and the ominous sound of a whip being uncoiled. "You dare to dictate conditions to me," Sarah finally said, her voice cold with fury. "On my own plantation?" Moses didn't flinch. "We've been working from before dawn till after dark since the others left. Double loads, half the hands, people collapsing in the fields from exhaustion. Children doing grown folks' work. It ain't right, and it ain't sustainable. Return to work immediately," Sarah said. "And I'll forget this. Lapse in judgment. Continue this defiance, and the consequences will be severe." Moses looked around at his fellow field hands, who remained seated, their expressions varying from terror to grim resolve. "We ain't working until things change, ma'am. We need proper rations, reasonable hours, and no more beatings for failing to meet impossible quotas." Sarah turned to Jefferson. "Arrest him. 20 lashes. publicly administered. The rest will return to work or face the same. Jefferson moved forward, but as he reached for Moses, something unexpected happened. The seated slaves rose as one, forming a protective circle around the older man. There was no violence, no threatening gestures, simply a wall of bodies standing in silent solidarity. Jefferson hesitated, looking back at Sarah for direction. The armed patrollers shifted uneasily, their hands moving to their weapons. The situation balanced on a knife's edge. Any wrong move could tip it into violence that would damage Rosewood far more than the temporary work stoppage. "Mrs. Thornfield," Jenkins said quietly from beside her, "perhaps we should discuss the workers' concerns in a more controlled environment." Sarah knew what he was suggesting. Remove Moses and any other perceived leaders from the field. Deal with them separately. Break the collective resistance through targeted punishment rather than confrontation with the entire group. It was a prudent approach, one that acknowledged the reality of the outnumbered patrollers and the potential for significant property damage if violence erupted. But something in Sarah rebelled against this concession, this acknowledgement of the slaves' power to force negotiation through collective action. Rosewood was her plantation. These were her slaves. Their obedience should be absolute, their labor given without question or condition. "Moses," she said, addressing the old man directly, "you and 3 others will come with me to the main house to discuss your concerns. The rest will return to work immediately. Those are my terms." A murmur ran through the assembled field hands. Moses conferred briefly with those nearest him, then nodded. "Agreed, ma'am, but if anything happens to us, the others stop working again." Sarah didn't acknowledge this condition, turning on her heel and walking back toward the main house with Jenkins at her side. Behind them, Moses and 3 other men, 2 middle-aged field hands and a younger man Sarah recognized as one of Isaiah's friends, followed at a respectful distance. Jefferson remained in the field to oversee the resumption of work, his expression dark with suppressed anger at being undermined. "This is unprecedented," Jenkins murmured as they walked. "A coordinated work stoppage. I've never seen anything like it." "It's the broadside," Sarah replied tersely, "and whatever other communications have been coming from the escaped slaves. They're being encouraged to resist, to demand better conditions." "Which puts us in a difficult position," Jenkins observed. "We need the harvest brought in. Without it, Rosewood cannot survive financially." Sarah didn't respond to this obvious truth. The cotton in the fields represented Rosewood's income for the coming year, the means to pay debts, purchase supplies, and maintain the plantation's operations. If the harvest failed or was significantly delayed, the financial consequences would be devastating. In the study, Sarah took her seat behind the desk while Moses and the 3 other slaves stood before her, their posture respectful but not subservient. Jenkins remained standing near the door, a silent witness to this extraordinary meeting. "Speak," Sarah said to Moses. "What are these conditions you demand?" Moses straightened his shoulders. "First, reasonable work hours. Dawn to dusk, with proper breaks for rest and food. Second, adequate rations. The cuts you made after Mr. Thornfield died have left people hungry and weak. Third, no punishment for failing to meet impossible quotas. And fourth, no separation of families through sale or trading." Sarah listened with growing anger as Moses enumerated these demands. They were reasonable, she had to admit privately. In fact, they merely asked for a return to the conditions that had existed during Theodore's management of Rosewood. But granting them would be seen as weakness, as capitulation to slave demands rather than the benevolence of a mistress. "You speak of Mr. Thornfield," Sarah said when Moses had finished. "Did you know he was planning to free some of the slaves before his death?" The question clearly caught Moses by surprise. He exchanged glances with the other men before responding cautiously. "There were rumors, ma'am. Nothing certain." "Isaiah knew," Sarah continued, watching their faces carefully. "Daniel, too. They were among those he intended to manumit. Did they tell you this? Is that why they were so quick to escape when the opportunity arose? I can't speak for Isaiah, ma'am, Moses replied, but I know he loved Rosewood in his way, worked this land for 7 years. It was only after conditions changed that thoughts of leaving became more common. The implication was clear. It was Sarah's management, her harshness after Theodore's death, that had driven the slaves to desperate measures. The accusation stung, all the more because she recognized its truth. She had been cruel, had driven the slaves harder, had reduced rations and increased punishments. Partly from financial necessity, partly from her own increasingly erratic judgment as her laudanum dependency deepened, and partly from a desire to assert control after years of chafing under Theodore's more lenient approach. Rosewood's financial situation necessitated changes after Mr. Thornfield's death, Sarah said, falling back on the justification she had told herself countless times. The plantation could not sustain the previous arrangements. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," said one of the other men, Samuel, a skilled field hand who could read and write, unusual among the slaves. But Rosewood was profitable under the old arrangements. The cotton yields were good, the expenses managed properly. It was only after— He hesitated, then continued more cautiously. After changes were made, that problems began. Sarah felt a surge of anger at this implied criticism of her management. But beneath the anger was an uncomfortable recognition of the truth, in Samuel's words. Rosewood had indeed been profitable under Theodore's management, despite what she had characterized as his excessive leniency toward the slaves. It was only after she had taken control, had imposed her harsher regime, that the plantation's finances had begun to deteriorate. "You overstep yourself," Sarah said coldly. "The financial management of Rosewood is not the concern of field hands." "With respect, ma'am," Moses interjected, "it becomes our concern when it affects our daily lives, our health, our families. We're asking for conditions that allow us to work effectively, to maintain our strength, to keep our families together, nothing more." Sarah was silent for a long moment, weighing her options. She could refuse outright, assert her authority through punishment of these leaders, and risk another work stoppage that would further delay the harvest. Or she could make concessions, grant some or all of their demands, and preserve the plantation's productivity at the cost of her pride and perceived authority. The laudanum she had taken earlier was wearing off, her head beginning to pound again, her thoughts becoming less clear. What would Theodore have done in this situation? The question came unbidden, surprising her with its urgency. Theodore, who had managed Rosewood profitably while maintaining conditions the slaves now sought to restore. Theodore, who had apparently been planning to free some of those slaves before his untimely death. A death in which she might have been complicit. "I will consider your requests," Sarah said finally. "In the meantime, the work in the East Field will continue at a reasonable pace. Rations will be increased immediately to previous levels. There will be no punishments for today's actions, provided work resumes promptly and continues without interruption." Relief was visible on the men's faces, though they maintained their dignified bearing. "Thank you, ma'am," Moses said, inclining his head slightly. "We'll return to the field now and inform the others." After they had gone, Jenkins closed the study door and turned to Sarah, his expression a mixture of surprise and concern. "That was unexpected, ma'am. A significant concession." "It was necessary," Sarah replied tersely. "We need the harvest brought in. Without it, Rosewood is finished regardless of how the slaves are treated." Jenkins hesitated, then spoke with unusual directness. "Mrs. Thornfield, I feel I must speak plainly. The situation at Rosewood has become increasingly precarious, not just financially, but in terms of management and control. The mass escape, the federal investigation, and now this work stoppage. These are symptoms of a deeper problem." Sarah stared at him, momentarily speechless at this forthright assessment. Jenkins had always been carefully respectful, offering advice only when asked, maintaining the proper distance between a plantation manager and the owner. "And what problem is that, Mr. Jenkins?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Jenkins met her gaze steadily. "The slaves no longer fear punishment enough to prevent resistance. The broadside from town, the news of successful escapes, the knowledge that others have found freedom, these have changed the calculation. They are now willing to risk punishment, even death, for the possibility of better conditions or escape." He paused. "And your health concerns have not gone unnoticed, ma'am." Sarah's fingers tightened around the edge of the desk. "My health is not your concern, Jenkins. With respect, ma'am, it becomes my concern when it affects the management of Rosewood." Jenkins' voice was gentle but firm. "Your increasing reliance on laudanum has been evident for some time. The erratic decisions, the mood swings, the physical symptoms, these undermine your authority and contribute to the plantation's instability. The accusation, for it was an accusation despite Jenkins' careful phrasing, hung in the air between them. Sarah wanted to deny it, to dismiss Jenkins for his impertinence, to assert control through anger and authority, but the words wouldn't come, because Jenkins was right, and they both knew it. "What would you suggest?" she asked instead, her voice barely above a whisper. Jenkins seemed surprised by this question, having clearly expected a more hostile response. "I would suggest, ma'am, that you consider consulting Dr. Phillips about reducing your laudanum usage gradually, and that you consider implementing the changes the field hands have requested, not as a concession to their demands, but as a return to the management approach that made Rosewood profitable under Mr. Thornfield's guidance." Sarah looked away, unable to meet Jenkins's sympathetic gaze. The suggestion was reasonable, measured, presented with respect and genuine concern. But it represented a fundamental challenge to everything she had done since Theodore's death. Her assertion of control, her rejection of his soft management approach, her increasing reliance on the drug that helped her cope with the pressures of running Rosewood alone. "Thank you for your candor, Mr. Jenkins," she said finally. "Please send for Dr. Phillips, and inform Jefferson of the changes to rations and work schedules, effective immediately." After Jenkins had gone, Sarah remained at her desk, staring at the ledgers without seeing them. The study felt suddenly too small, too confined, the walls pressing in around her. She rose and moved to the window, looking out at Rosewood's grounds. The sprawling fields, the slave quarters, the outbuildings, all representing the life she had built, the position she had secured through her marriage to Theodore. A life now threatened from multiple directions: the escaped slaves and the financial loss they represented, the federal investigation into possible fraud, the work stoppage and demands for better conditions, her own deteriorating health and judgment due to laudanum dependency, and underlying it all, the terrible possibility that she had contributed to Theodore's death through her careless administration of the same drug that now held her in its grip. The sound of hooves on the gravel drive drew her attention. A single rider approached the house, Sheriff Whitley, his portly figure unmistakable even at a distance. Sarah watched as he dismounted and handed the reins to a waiting stable boy, his movements betraying unusual urgency. Moments later, Lucy appeared at the study door to announce the sheriff's arrival. Sarah composed herself as best she could, straightening her dress and taking a deep breath before instructing Lucy to show Whitley in. The sheriff entered the study with none of his usual affable manner. His face was grim, his normally ruddy complexion pale beneath his whiskers. "Mrs. Thornfield," he said, removing his hat, "I'm afraid I bring disturbing news." Sarah steeled herself. "What is it, Sheriff?" Whitley reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. "I've received a warrant from the federal marshal in Savannah for your arrest." Sarah felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her feet. My arrest? On what charges? Conspiracy to commit fraud against insurance companies, false reporting of escaped slaves, and... Whitley hesitated, his discomfort evident, and suspicion of involvement in the death of Theodore Thornfield. The room seemed to spin around Sarah. She gripped the edge of her desk to steady herself. "That's absurd," she managed to say. "Completely unfounded." Whitley looked deeply uncomfortable. "The warrant cites testimony from multiple witnesses, Mum, including your former house slave, Esther, and Dr. Phillips." Dr. Phillips. The name struck Sarah like a physical blow. The physician who had prescribed the laudanum for Theodore, who had declared his death due to a heart condition, who had continued to supply Sarah with the drug in increasing quantities since then, if he had turned against her, had testified to federal authorities. "Dr. Phillips would never make such accusations," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. Whitley didn't meet her eyes. "He came forward yesterday, ma'am, brought his medical records with him, said his conscience wouldn't allow him to remain silent any longer." He cleared his throat. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Thornfield, but I must ask you to accompany me to town. The federal marshal will arrive tomorrow to take you to Savannah for questioning." Sarah's mind raced, seeking some way out of this catastrophe. "This is Montgomery's doing," she said, grasping at the most obvious explanation. "He wanted to acquire Rosewood, and when I refused him, he fabricated these charges to destroy me." Whitley shook his head. "Mr. Montgomery had nothing to do with this, ma'am. The investigation began with information provided by escaped slaves who reached Ohio. Specifically, your former house slave, Esther, who made a sworn statement to federal authorities there." Esther. The name echoed in Sarah's mind, bringing with it the image of the older woman's face, serene, dignified, revealing nothing of her thoughts as she moved efficiently through her duties at Rosewood. Esther, who had seen Sarah administering laudanum to Theodore night after night. Esther, who was Solomon Porter's mother, now free in Ohio and apparently determined to bring Sarah to justice for her role in Theodore's death. "I need time," Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Time to consult with my lawyer, to prepare a defense against these false accusations." Whitley shifted uncomfortably. "I can give you until tomorrow morning, ma'am, but no longer. The federal authorities are most insistent." He replaced his hat. "I'll return at 9 o'clock tomorrow to escort you to town. Please be ready." After the sheriff had gone, Sarah remained motionless at her desk, the full weight of her situation settling upon her. Arrest, public accusation, a trial where Esther, Dr. Phillips, and perhaps others would testify against her. The scandal would destroy her reputation regardless of the eventual verdict. Rosewood would be ruined, its value plummeting, its future uncertain, and if she were found guilty, Sarah couldn't bring herself to complete the thought. The penalty for murder, for that was what the charge would amount to, despite whatever legal terminology might be used, was hanging. A plantation mistress would likely be spared such a public execution, but life imprisonment was a very real possibility. Sarah opened the desk drawer and removed the crystal vial of laudanum, now nearly empty. Her hand trembled as she unstoppered it and raised it to her lips, drinking the last of the bitter liquid directly. She needed the drug's clarity now, needed the artificial calm it provided to think through her options. As the laudanum began to take effect, Sarah considered what remained to her. She could flee, gather what valuables she could carry, take a horse from the stable, and ride for the coast. With enough money, passage could be booked on a ship to Cuba or South America, places beyond the reach of American authorities. But such a flight would be an admission of guilt, would confirm the accusations against her in the public mind. She could stay and fight the charges, maintain her innocence, challenge the testimony of Esther and Dr. Phillips. But the evidence against her was apparently substantial enough for a federal warrant, and her laudanum dependency would be exposed during a trial, further undermining her credibility and reinforcing the narrative of her guilt. Or she could end it now, on her own terms. Theodore had kept a pistol in the bottom drawer of the desk, a small, elegant weapon with a pearl handle. Sarah had never fired it, had barely acknowledged its existence after Theodore's death, but she knew it was there, knew it was loaded. The thought was strangely calming, an end to the uncertainty, the fear, the growing recognition of her own culpability in the deterioration of Rosewood, and perhaps in Theodore's death. An escape of a different kind than that sought by her slaves, but an escape nonetheless. As evening fell over the plantation, Sarah made her final preparations. She wrote 3 letters, one to Jenkins, instructing him on the management of Rosewood in her absence, one to her sister in Charleston, explaining her situation and asking her to ensure that Sarah received a proper burial beside Theodore, and one addressed simply to whom it may concern, in which she maintained her innocence of the charges while acknowledging her dependency on laudanum and its effects on her judgment. This last letter was the most difficult to write, requiring a level of honesty with herself that Sarah had long avoided. The laudanum had indeed clouded her thinking, had led her to make decisions that harmed Rosewood and those who worked its fields. She had been harsh where Theodore had been measured, had prioritized control over productivity, had rejected his more humane approach to plantation management out of pride and a desire to assert herself after years in his shadow. And yes, she had administered laudanum to Theodore in increasing doses, telling herself it was for his own good, to help him sleep, to calm his anxieties about the plantation. Had she known it might harm him? Perhaps not consciously, but there had been warnings from doctors, from books, from Theodore himself as he became aware of the drug's effects. Warnings she had chosen to ignore. The confession complete, Sarah sealed all 3 letters and placed them prominently on the desk. Night had fallen completely now, the plantation quiet beyond her window. In the distance, she could see the soft glow of fires from the slave quarters, where the field hands would be gathered after their day's labor, perhaps discussing the concessions they had won through their collective action. Sarah opened the bottom drawer of the desk and removed Theodore's pistol, its weight unfamiliar in her hand. The pearl handle gleamed in the lamplight as she raised it, the barrel cool against her temple. In that final moment, as her finger tightened on the trigger, Sarah's thoughts returned to Isaiah and Daniel, the field hand and his son, whose escape had precipitated Rosewood's unraveling. They were free now, somewhere in the north, beyond the reach of slave catchers and plantation justice, free to build new lives, to work for themselves rather than for an owner, to keep the fruits of their labor. A freedom Sarah had never considered they might deserve, might desire as desperately as she now desired release from her own circumstances. A freedom Theodore had apparently recognized they should have, had been planning to grant them before his untimely death. The irony was not lost on Sarah as she closed her eyes. The image of Isaiah's defiant gaze, the last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her. In the weeks that followed, Rosewood Plantation became a focal point for the growing tensions between North and South. The story of Sarah Thornfield's suicide, the escaped slaves who had reached freedom, and the work stoppage that had won improved conditions for those who remained, became a symbol for abolitionists of the system's inherent instability. For Southern plantation owners, it represented a cautionary tale of Northern interference and the dangers of allowing any challenge to established authority. The federal investigation continued despite Sarah's death, uncovering evidence that Theodore had indeed been planning to free several slaves, including Isaiah and Daniel, and had been moving money into a separate account to provide for their establishment as free men. Sarah's administration of laudanum was documented in Dr. Phillips' records and Esther's testimony, though whether she had intentionally contributed to Theodore's death remained a matter of speculation. Jenkins managed Rosewood through the harvest season, implementing the changes Moses and the other field hands had demanded. The plantation returned to profitability, though it never regained the prominence it had held under Theodore's management. Eventually, it was sold to a consortium of investors from Charleston, its lands divided among smaller farms, its grand house converted into a hospital during the Civil War that would engulf the nation less than a decade later. Isaiah and Daniel settled in a small community of freed slaves in Ohio, where they were eventually joined by others from Rosewood, including Harriet, who had helped coordinate the mass escape. They never returned to Georgia, but their story was passed down through generations, a testament to the courage of those who risked everything for freedom and the complex, often tragic consequences of a system built on human bondage. And in the small family graveyard, behind what had once been the main house of Rosewood Plantation, Sarah Thornfield lay beside her husband, their shared headstone eventually weathered by time and the changing seasons until the names were barely legible, a final obscurity for a woman whose desire for control had ultimately led to her own destruction.